Morning, everyone. I'll just try and share my screen before I get going. Okay, so I want to talk to you briefly around assurance. There are different ways we can think of what assurance is, but I'm talking in the broad spectrum here. So it includes, for instance, regulation. It includes things like accreditation agencies. It may also, at a more local level though, include things like overview and scrutiny, or indeed any formal approach to how do we reassure ourselves that the right things are happening in our organisations and communities. My presentation is a bit less focused on the context of COVID-19 though, although I think it applies in our current context too. So just to start off, I suppose the easy thing to do is to say all that regulation stuff is a load of nonsense, let's just get rid of it. But I think if we're more empathetic with why have we created these systems, I think we can see there's a legitimate need for assurance. And I would articulate that in simple terms as a need to have confidence that the things that really matter are the things that are really being managed, so that the things that really matter are the things that are really being done. If we can't be confident that what really matters is what's really done, then we've got problems. So for me, assurance exists to help us solve this problem, to meet this need. And the default approach to how we achieve that has been through mechanisms that are broadly speaking about accountability. So when we think about accountability, I would say, generally speaking, we end up talking about one of the three things that are on screen, or a combination of them. So transparency, how easy is it to see what's happening, what's working, what's not working, what's going on. Evaluation, what sense do we make of that stuff that we've made transparent? How do we think we're doing? Is it good what we're seeing, or is it bad? And sometimes consequence, which could be positive reward because good stuff's happening, or it could be more punitive and saying actually what's going on isn't tolerable and we now need to act. Yeah, so accountability mechanisms, I think, tend to deal in those three moving parts. And because of that, I want to suggest to you that they can be self-defeating. So what we often see is that the evaluation and consequence components of accountability can drive fear, which in turn can drive a lack of transparency, and can manifest in this game of cat and mouse. So, you know, we kind of occasionally, or maybe more than occasionally, maybe systemically find that we play a game of seeming to be transparent, but actually more presenting what we think people want to see or what we want to show them, rather than genuinely exposing a warts and all picture of what's going on so we can learn. So often in this sphere, we talk about things like gaming, but I want to suggest to you that gaming isn't a problem with the players, if you like. It's a problem with the fact that we've made performance a game. And I think that speaks to the evaluation component. Any approach to evaluation of performance that treats it as a score to be kept automatically turns it into a game to be played. In other words, it makes players of us. So I want to suggest to you that accountability, as traditionally manifest, produces a pathological relationship with accountability, a relationship based on fear. And so even though we have a legitimate desire for something that creates responsible practice, that enables transparency, that creates this world in which we're able to see what's happening and discover new and better ways of meeting what matters, accountability doesn't get us there. So as an intervention strategy, I would suggest to you accountability is fundamentally flawed. So if you buy that, or if you at least see that there's something interesting to explore there, I think the question arises, can we create a different relationship with assurance, one that moves us out of the pathological and into the generative? So in other words, one that perhaps gets rid of the fear of evaluation evaluation and consequence in order to prioritize a commitment to transparency and learning. And this is sort of, I guess, the best summary I can come up with of what I think I've learned so far in trying to do that. And this has been action learning with a number of people, and also learning from others that have been doing action learning on this. But I think what we've seen is that unless we're prepared to shift along two axes, we don't get the benefit of a shift from pathological to generative. So the first axis along the bottom here is shifting from seeing the role of those that are looking for assurance as being apart from the system, standing outside of the system, maintaining independence and objectivity. Shifting from that worldview to actually seeing the role of assurance and those seeking assurance as being a part of the system. So if you just put that in the context of regulation for a minute, what I'm suggesting here is the more the regulator behaves as if they are outside of the system that they are regulating, the more likely they are to drive fear of evaluation and consequence, and therefore, ironically, the heavier they land within the system that they're assuring. So they almost become a more significant part of the system by behaving as if they're apart from it. So the second axis, the vertical one here, is moving from evaluation as scorekeeping to evaluation as sense-making. So in other words, rather than treating performance as a score to be kept, where we render definitive judgments of this is good or this is bad and to what extent, we move to performance as sense-making, where it's not about keeping score in performance, but it's about working out together what different ways we can understand what's happening are, looking to practice, if you like, systematic empathy with the different perspectives that sit around performance and how we can make sense of it. And so the focus is less on how do we evaluate the performance and more on what can we learn from what we're seeing in order to take productive action. And so as we move across those two axes, what I'm suggesting to you is assurance 1.0, kind of the world as we have known it, is in this bottom left box. We have the pretense of independence and objectivity, and we keep score, and that creates fear. Lots of well-intended behaviour is, well, you know, as regulators or as people in overview and scrutiny committees or whatever, we want to get closer to the work, but turning up and then rendering evaluative judgments doesn't really move us a long way forward. So another well-intended move is up here, which is actually we get that we need to move away from scorekeeping. We get that that drives gaming, but pretending that we can still have this independence and objectivity, in my experience, drives a sort of physical distance that drives a power distance that actually maintains the pathological dynamic. So for me, the call to regulators and others is to try and get into this top box, to actually kind of get in there, get your hands dirty, build genuine relationships that are around the process of sense making by accepting and by demonstrating through our behaviour that we are part of this system, not apart from the system. And in order to do that, I think there's plenty of stuff that we can learn from practice and from other spheres. So one useful point of learning, I think, is to reconceive the role of regulator or those seeking assurance from providing evaluative feedback, in other words, rendering definitive judgments, to supporting accurate reflection. So when we turn up, our job isn't to be the one saying, here's what I think is going on and this is how I view it, but rather to ask the open questions to help people to adopt that practice of systematic empathy, to help people to look from multiple perspectives in order to make sense of the world. So supporting accurate reflection, I think, can be a useful role. And therefore, we can reconceive our role from holding to account to helping to account. So how are we helping people to make sense of and tell the story of the performance, rather than how are we seeking to evaluate that? Now, in doing that, a couple of things that, again, I think we've learned. Locus of control is really, really important. So in order to move from the pathological to the generative, it really helps to think about how do we keep the locus of control essentially in the work rather than away from the work. So in other words, how can we help people who are doing the work to have control over what work they choose to do, how they choose to do it, and how they are going to approach the evaluation of that work. And again, this isn't a kind of black and white thing of saying all work is local. So it's relevant that there's different work happening at different levels of recursion. So we should put the locus of control wherever that work is being done. And therefore, in terms of that role of enabling accurate reflection, again, I think we can learn from lots of good coaching practices. So this is an adaptation of Gerard Egan's skilled helper model, but we can turn up in ways that are more and less helpful in order to support that accurate reflection and to maintain that locus of control. I'm not going to go through this slide in detail, but it's really a placeholder for saying there is technology, there is learning around how we move from pathological to generative in lots of spheres. So that's an opportunity for us to learn from that, to practice that, and to therefore see what does that do in the world of public service. So I'm going to finish up on this slide, which is to say that sometimes when I talk about these things, there can be a misperception that I have it in for the regulator, or I have it in for people with formal authority and power. I absolutely don't. I think the opportunity in all of this is actually not to be critical of what those people are doing and their intent and their value, but rather to recognize that if we can make this shift to more generative models of regulation and assurance, then they become genuine accelerators of effective practice and would be experienced as such. So I actually think this is an enormous opportunity and something we should be excited for.